Welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city, a city with 450 years and more of exciting historical events. Now, in many of the stories we've recorded, we've sometimes have talked about whole regimes under foreign flags. Sometimes we talked about wars. Sometimes we talked about a few people. But today we're going to deal with a single subject, something that happened worldwide, and yet our focus is primarily here in Pensacola. And that story, of course, is of the great influenza pandemic that struck the world during the year 1918. Now, we've had all kinds of stories through history of plagues and panics and things of that kind, but we can take them all the way back to biblical times when the Jewish people were chided and a plague struck upon them because Moses said that they had worshipped the idol, the golden calf that Aaron created. And we go forward through the years, and plagues come along every once in a while. A couple of them that we can use as benchmarks come from England. In 1348, right in the middle of the 100 Years' War, a plague struck England which knocked out about 1/5 of all the people. We're not sure what it was. People now today believe it was what they called the Black Death then. Perhaps that was bubonic plague, because bubonic came back to England. Again, in this year it was 1665, and in that year, an estimated 1/3 of all the people of that country were killed or died because of the plague. Well, now, here in Florida, we've had our share of problems of that kind. Pensacola, back from British times, was said to have been a community beset by fevers. And they were, of course, concerned about things that came out of the swamps, and they weren't sure what caused them. But malaria and yellow fever were two of the things that people worried about most here. And then we did have serious problems with them. The last of them, of course, came in 1882, then again in 1897, and the final one in 1905, when more than 250 people right here died because of that fever. But now, when we come to 1918, we have a very different sort of situation. Beginning in January of that year, what came upon virtually all of the Western world was what people called an ordinary case of influenza. And that is a viral disease. People were not sure how it originated, but nonetheless, this was communicable between persons. And so beginning in January of that year, not only across the Western world, but other places too, and here in the United States, people began to suffer with influenza. Well, at first people said, well, it's just an ordinary flu, because it was attacking the older people and the very young, and this went on for about 60 days. It was serious. Numbers of people actually died of it. It died down a little bit, and then beginning in the month of July, it began to pick up once more, and this time it was going all across the world in large numbers. Now, in the United States, people recognized the presence of this disease first in the state of Kansas, where people there were becoming ill. These were people of a younger age. They were of military age, and some believe that one of the reasons this quickly spread to Europe was that some young men who were in training at Fort Riley, Kansas, picked up the disease. It wasn't apparent when they got on the boat to go overseas, but when they got overseas, this disease spread among the troops in France. This was serious. So, and as the disease began to spread among the troops, here we are. There was nowhere for these people to go. You couldn't simply escape and say, we'll close this down and stop people from communicating. It was in the trenches, and large numbers of people from the German army, from the French army, from the English army, from the Italian, they all were affected by it, and the numbers were very large. Well, back here in the United States, we began to see more and more of this coming to us. And as it did, now instead of being the older generation, this was a younger generation that was being affected by this new wave, which apparently the result of this was much more serious. And these were younger people in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and it was particularly deadly to women who were pregnant. And of course, the worst of it was that really they did not have any cure for this. There was no sense in basically of prevention, and we'll get back to that again in just a moment. But the flu was spreading. And before long, the headlines in the newspapers, which in 1918, of course, were covering the war very heavily, these headlines now began to focus a little bit on how this flu was spreading. It was in China, it was in India, it was in Samoa, it was in the islands of the South Pacific. Everywhere you could turn, this influenza was just affecting people. And the question was, well, who was responsible? Some people said, well, we would talk about these people in Kansas, but maybe it started in China. We think maybe it might have begun there. And how did it spread? Well, some people said, well, over time of this kind of thing has been spread by rats and ticks and insects, or maybe flying birds, migrating birds were responsible for it. But everyone was guessing, but no one really had a firm idea. Well, as this moved ahead, people in our own area began to be affected by it. And you have to remember, now we're talking about the year 1918, and our Sacred Heart Hospital, or Pensacola Hospital called in those days, had been open just about 3 years, and they began to receive more and more patients of this type. Happily, this, of course, 1918, the hospital had been there 3 years. They were equipped to handle about 100 patients. And happily, some of their records have survived. And you could page through those records, and segment after segment showed people being admitted with a diagnosis of influenza of some sort. Well, of course, we had a medical society, medical presence in Pensacola at the beginning of the war of about 38 men, but by the time the United States had really begun to call people up, that had been cut almost in half. So we had just about 20 physicians able to spread themselves all across the community. And they of course, they did the very best that they possibly could. But before things had progressed very far, they were running out of some of the very basic things you could. And of course, all they could do, really, to make people comfortable, the physicians and the hospital itself were saying, we need to have the druggists available to have all of the known remedies that we can prescribe. Also, we want the ice companies to be producing extra ice to make people comfortable. That's really about all that felt that they could do. Out at what was then called the Pensacola Pensacola Aeronautical Station, the hospital there was practically brand new. And the record toward the end, and this is by the end of 1918, showed that they had over 1,600 admissions for influenza in the course of the months of just this war. And their records gave us some specifics that from the Naval Aviation Group out there, 25 of the 1,600 who were admitted actually died of the disease. Well, as we moved along and across the European theater, the countries that were deeply involved in the war didn't want to have flu statistics affect morale at home. So they began to hide some of the numbers. And to this day, we're not sure what they really were. But ultimately, we know from the basic statistics that were published, something in the neighborhood of 300,000 people in Great Britain died of this influenza. About 400,000 died in France, and the German death count was somewhere between 200 and 300,000. But those numbers are low, because what was later discovered was that the nations, they were hiding the numbers because they didn't want to just add this to the other alarm of all the people who were actually dying in the trenches. The one figure that gave us a real number was from Spain. Spain was not in the war, and so their health department was recording accurately how many went, and their numbers were much greater in Spain. The deaths in Spain were much, much greater than they had been in France and England and Germany. So basically, people began to say, well, this is a very interesting statistic. Let's change the name of what we've been working with. We'll call this Spanish influenza. And that's where the name came from, but it wasn't that the plague originated in Spain. It's just that number happened to be affixed to it. Okay, back in this country now and across the world, these numbers are accelerating. 200,000 here, 300,000 there, and basically the numbers as they have come down to us later show that of those who were actually afflicted, those who actually caught the disease, as many as 20% died. Now, again, the numbers overall across the world, and again, these are very fragmented numbers, we believe that between 50 and 100 million people died between January of 1918 and the end of January of 1919. Well, here in the Pensacola area, what did people do? How were they going to stop the spread of the disease? Well, we had two men that shared the mayor's role here in that period. That was because an election happened to fall right in the middle. One was named as George Johnson, and the other was F.M. Pugh. And these two men, as soon as this was epidemic proportion here, they decided, well, we've got to close things down so that people don't mingle in large numbers and so infect one another. So basically, they went to A.S. Edwards, who was the school superintendent, and urged him just to not open the schools. Let's keep the kids at home. Don't put them in congregate numbers. And Edwards agreed. That's what they would do. The motion picture houses were closed down. No one could go to the movies. Churches, one after the other, the sessions or the elders and the pastors agreed that it didn't make sense to bring all the people together and possibly infect their parishioners. So the churches ceased meeting. Lodges and places like that where people normally would congregate, they just didn't. Well, they reached a point in the month of October of 1918 where, here, get an idea how the situation had come. The streetcars, of course, were a major source of transport here for our people in that period. And in that period, there were 118 men and women employed by the streetcar system. On the 18th of October, a report came out that there were 18 men who were physically able to run the streetcars. And they did the best they could, but obviously the four routes could not be fully operating that time. The telephone system had the same, because this is not dial tone period now. This is where you still had an operator in between who took your number and plugged in the right dials. They were down to the point that one afternoon, they were down to 3 operators able to do business, and obviously that was going to cut things way, way back, and of course it did. The drugstores had pretty much the same problem. They finally agreed that they would allow 3 of them that would still remain open. The D'Alembert Pharmacy, the Smith Pharmacy, and the Polkenhorn pharmacies all remained open. The rest of them agreed that they would close down as a precautionary measure. Well, basically, that's the way things proceeded right here in Pensacola. We have in the month of October, latter part of October, one of the nurses, a sister Veronica at the hospital, wrote a long letter to her sister, her supervisor back in Maryland, saying that at that point in time they had only 6 nurses, including some volunteers, who were able to care for their patients, and every bed in the hospital was full, in addition to which there were some that they were taking care of on cots in the halls. They had over 100 patients there, and as the nurse said, we had run out of everything we could think of to do with it. We no longer had oxygen that we could give these people. It was just a very serious situation. Of course, other people began to develop things that might help. Those of you in the audience who may have used Vicks VapoRub or Vicks Salve at one time in your life, that was one of the products that was developed by a pharmacist in North Carolina. And in several ways, Vicks did help people in breathing and as a kind of a balm to their chest. The medical staff locally here, as I said, we were down to about 20 people. Dr. Ames, Dr. Payne, Dr. Hutchinson, Dr. Webb, all of these people just worked themselves almost, I can't say to the death, but they worked themselves extremely hard on this. And of course, the program went forward. We moved finally into the month of January 1919, and slowly the numbers of cases being reported began to diminish. And by the time we reached the end of the month of January, we could almost say that it looks like the epidemic or the pandemic is over. But in the course of that time, well, we have no accurate number to tell us how many from Pensacola itself died, but we do know that across the United States, we had almost 500,000 people who died from that epidemic in that year. We lost as many people from influenza as we did battlefield casualties all through the World War I. So you can see influenza, Spanish influenza, across the world and here in Pensacola was a big story in the year 1918. And fortunately, we have not had anything like that since.